Alrighty, so I've got another deck guide for you. This is going to be another Tarkintown deck. It's Cad Bane this time. This is actually the third iteration of a deck guide I've done on Cad Bane. I did one when he was first released in set 2. I did a follow-up in set 3 with the release of the Cad Bane unit, kind of elevating the deck, and I believe he's gotten even more help in this set than he has before. There's a ton of new Underworld cards to look at, and this might be the time for him to kind of solidify himself as one of the few 6-drop leaders worthy of consideration in a world of very powerful 4 and 5 cost leaders. Before we get going, please hit that subscribe button. It helps out the channel a ton. And if you're looking for more content from me, including live updates to the deck that you are about to get a video on, then do check out my Patreon. I got a lot going on there. And with that, let's get to it. So, table of contents. First up, is this a real contender? I think this deck has a good shot of making its way into some tournament games and winning some events. It was winning in set 3, not a ton, but it was lurking towards that bottom of the area of like decks that were winning a few events. It had notoriously a very, very difficult matchup into Django, primarily because Lurking TIE Phantom was in that deck, and it was very difficult to kind of piece together a game plan that you were able to remove it, and you do just kind of get bricked by that card. But that card doesn't seem to be very popular anymore because of how much new space there is in the game, and it's just a measly 2/2. And on top of that, there's a new card that we'll talk about that actually answers it very cleanly. Now, that's not to say Django has all of a sudden become an easy matchup. It has not, neither has Han, but this is one of the few decks, especially one of the few 6-cost leader decks that can actually create a game plan that can work into those matchups, and that means it's a decent place to start. So how is the breakdown of this video going to go? I'm going to talk about the leader and the Tarkintown combo and kind of just give you a little bit of an overview there, talk a bit about where Cad Bane fits in terms of like the aggro, midrange, and control paradigm. Then straight to the deck list where we'll break down the entire list card by card. I'm going to do a 2-drop deep dive because there are a lot of options in that slot, and we'll talk about the ones that I've put into the deck currently, but also ones that I'm considering and ways that you can shift that slot in future building. We'll talk about the leader strategy with the pings and his flip turn and kind of what you're looking for and what you're trying to accomplish on that turn. Talk about a concept of bridging with this leader. That's kind of trying to piece together your early to the mid game to the end game, and like how you're going to bridge from each part of the game to that flip and then past that flip. We'll talk about the passing and not to pass. It's something I talked about in the Quinlan video earlier this week as well. The answer is not going to be the same as it is with Quinlan, so should be an interesting conversation. I'm going to talk a bit about the card Cham Syndulla, which is a pretty significant new card that was released with Jump to Lightspeed and works particularly well with Cad Bane, although it is not an Underworld unit. I'm going to talk about the omission of Jabba the Hutt and his trick package. I mean, there are some tricks, but not nearly as many as have been in previous iterations of this deck. Then we'll do a brief matchup conversation. It'll be just focusing on what I see as maybe 3 of the more popular decks right now. We'll talk about the sideboard, and then we'll talk about the maybe board. So some cards that you can be looking at to tweak the deck with. All right, so why are we playing Cad Bane? Well, Cad Bane gives you pseudo-controlled pings, similar to Quinlan. Both have different restrictions. Cad Banes are much easier to proc. All you do is fill your deck full of Underworld cards, which is what we are going to do. You should be getting a ping basically every turn. They add up, especially in conjunction with Tarkintown, which lets you keep the board kind of clean early on, which lets your pings kind of hone in onto whatever it is you're trying to do. Why else are these pings useful? With ambush units, you can sometimes create trade-ups, because if there's only one unit in play, your ambush unit basically ambushes for +1 with Cad Bane's ability. And then this card, McClunky, is absolutely crazy with Cad Bane because it's actually 1 cost to deal 4, and it can actually do it to 2 different targets if needed. Do remember that you have to resolve the entire text on an event before you proc Cad Bane's ability. So if you play McClunky, you must do the 3 before you can do the 1 with Cad Bane. It's different when you have something like an ambush unit where both are kind of when played, right? Cad Bane's ability is when you play an Underworld. Ambush is a when played effect, so you can actually stack them however you want. So you can ambush first, defeat the unit, and then the other unit that's still in play, for instance, can then get pinged. You don't have to let your opponent pick the ping first. But with McClunky, 3 goes first. So why Tarkintown? Well, I think that's self-explanatory here, right? There's not going to be a lot of red cards in this deck. In the main deck, there's only going to be 2. One of them you can see right here, IG-2000, an incredible new Underworld card that fits perfectly with what Cad Bane's trying to do. It's not quite as cracked as it is with Django, but it's actually pretty close. But Tarkintown lets you control the board, and that's all we're trying to do. We are trying to keep your opponent's board with as little units as possible so that our pings become more effective. When your opponent has multiple units in play, the pings become worse naturally because they get to put them wherever they want. So we try to keep it clean, and Tarkintown is the easiest way to enable that. I have been asked a lot of times, like, well, you're playing like 47 yellow cards. Why isn't this a mono yellow deck? I honestly just don't think the mono yellow cards do very much for the Cad Bane archetype. Like Bodhi, Cantina Bouncer, both good cards, neither are Underworld. Cunning is solid, but it's much more of an aggro tempo card, and I do not think Cad Bane is an aggro deck. Obviously, if I could run it for 4 in this deck, I probably would, but I don't think it's worth giving up Tarkintown and the couple of pretty important red cards that you will see. Past that, yeah, like you can even look at the neutral base card for 34 health, because it is primarily a mono yellow, but I just think Tarkintown is incredibly valuable. IG-2000, incredibly valuable, and a lot of the other cards that we'll see, especially some sideboard helpers, can help shore up some matchups. So I mentioned already that I don't think this deck is an aggro deck. In fact, it's like barely even a mid-range deck. Like Control, I know normally when you think about Control, it's like, okay, I play removal, events, removal, kill your stuff until we get to some giant spaceship that beats our opponent. But Cad Bane really is kind of a unit-based control deck. It's just trying to control the board until it can flip and kind of bridge through its flip turn. He puts out a very difficult to remove leader and then goes up the curve. He's trying to create a board advantage with units and then turn the corner where you have more units than your opponent and you start pushing damage towards their base. It's kind of a mid-range deck. It's kind of a control deck. It's definitely not an aggro deck. This does not have particularly fast closing speed, but when left uninteracted with, it can start chunking a lot of damage. It does play some big bodies, especially in the 4, 5, 6, 7 range of unit costs, and if left kind of to do its thing on the ground, it can start punching big damage. But primary goal, control the board, control your opponent until you can turn the corner. All right, let's look at the deck list here. So McClunky, I mentioned it. This card, being an Underworld event, triggers Cad. It's very cheap, very nifty interaction. Now, we're not playing any 1-drops in this deck, although we'll talk about that in a moment. It is certainly an option and something I will be considering. The turn 1 McClunky play, it becomes enabled in that way, but McClunky is still very good. You got these 2-drops that are easy to like replay if needed, or just to resource if you don't. And it just adds a ton of damage, and it works very well with Bosk too, which you can see lower on this list, because you get a 3 plus a 1 plus a 2 potentially. When Cad Bane is out, this McClunky can actually deal 5 damage. Remember, you can cycle this card if you have no friendly non-leaders. If you just have Cad Bane out, you can actually just play this card to deal 2 damage to something, which is kind of cool. But McClunky is a very versatile card and very powerful. Hot Chop Blaster in this list too. It does help a little bit with the closing speed, especially when you can get this on Cad Bane, making him hit for 6. He's a very sturdy unit. 8 health is an absolute ton. And I really like having Hot Chop Blasters and access to this card in this deck. I don't have Surprise Strike in here currently, but Hot Chop Blaster makes the cut. being a permanent buff to Cad Bane, where he can kind of like maybe even get multiple attacks throughout a game with that blaster. The 2-drops, Bazine, Cartel Spacer, Crafty Smuggler, Sedana, Thano, and Zygerian Starhopper. We'll talk about all that in a moment in the 2-drop slide, so bear with me. No Good to Me Dead. I'm up to 3 here. This card is here because of Han and how good Mono Yellow Han is. We'll talk more about that matchup later, but I just want to kind of emphasize that Mono Yellow Han is a very difficult matchup for Cad Bane if the Han player knows how to maneuver it, knows that really all they need to do is keep the board empty until their flip turn, because there's very little in the Cad Bane deck that kind of interacts on that flip turn outside of No Good to Me Dead. It's very, very easy for Han to DJ you if you don't have this card. And you know, there's ways that they can rip this card out of your hand too, like with Bodhi. So No Good to Me Dead is here because of how good it is against Han, especially for the Cad Bane archetype, because it's a 6-drop leader that is more susceptible to getting DJ'd. It does have utility in other matchups. Of course, it is not a bad card against any aggressive deck. Sabine, Django, even like Quinlan. It's going to come up in other matchups too, but it probably wouldn't be up here in 3x if it wasn't for Han. Now let's look at the 3-drops. You got Boba Fett, Contracted Jumpmaster, and Mist Hunter. So Boba Fett, just the best 3/5 underworld we can get, and a very good unit. There's others like DJ, for instance, but Boba Fett, of course, is the best one we can have here. Contracted Jumpmaster, a new card and a very impressive one. 4 health in space with the Sentinel that also triggers the underworld. Much better than something like Black Sun, which I had run in the past. This card has been very helpful, especially against Django. And then Mist Hunter, this replaced Punishing One, which is another like just generic 3/4. For the most part, this is just a generic 3/4. It does not proc very often, although we do have a share of bounty hunters, right? You have Boba Fett, you have Forlom, you have Bosk, Zuckuss. So it is possible that you trigger this. I have done it in the past. You play Mist Hunter, next turn you Forlom, then you attack with your Mist Hunter, draw a card. That's great. Huge upside there. There's a few other ships in this slot that you can run. Punishing One is one of them, especially now that there are more upgraded units flying around. Maybe Punishing One could trigger, but Mist Hunter, I think, has been the best in that slot. Relentless Pursuit is another card that has been in and out of decks. Now, we'll talk about it later with like why Jabba isn't here and what it has allowed me to do with the events. But basically, used to not really have room for stuff like this if you needed to be mostly running tricks. But I'm not running Jabba right now, so I get a little more freedom in the events. And Relentless Pursuit is another card that's very good against Django, especially off the Cad Bane leader. He can capture 6-cost units like War Juggernaut and Ruthless Raider, and even give you a shield, which then lets him attack without getting exhausted. There's other bounty hunters here like Boba, Forlom, Boss. All these units can get shields, which can help a lot and keep them around a little more. Relentless Pursuit lets you go cross arena, something that a lot of cards and interaction doesn't let you do. So it's just a very good card. I think it's at its best in a Cad Bane deck because he is just a very chunky bounty hunter. Forlom, Zuckuss. So both, like Forlom specifically, you got an ambush unit. Talked about how with Cad Bane's ability, the ambush lets you trade up, so you can Forlom into 5 health units. If they're the only unit in play, you will kill them with Cad Bane's ping. Very useful, just a good sturdy unit. And then Zuckuss, you know, he's our chunky guy. If you ever get this off with Forlom, you may win games on the spot. There's times where you can just like Forlom, not even ambush, and just force your opponent into a weird situation where if they like do something and let you claim, and then you just go bam Zuckuss, you could like get tremendous value from there. But Zuckuss also has some value just being like a guy you slam. You know, we don't love like 5-cost 6/6 do nothings, but at least you actually do something when you play this. You get a ping with Cad Bane, so it's not quite a do nothing. Bosk, I mentioned earlier, it's another ambush unit. Now 4/5 is not the greatest stat line, but there is a lot of upside to Bosk sticking around with some cheap events like McClunky, No Good to Me Dead, even Relentless Pursuit, which lets you capture something and then deal 2 damage to something else off of Bosk. So just having a little more ambush in this deck is nice, and Bosk would compete kind of with the Syndicate Lackey, which is a card that we will consider. All right, let's talk about Cham Syndulla briefly, but we will talk about it a lot more later. It's good against Ramp, and it's good against Han, but we'll do a deep dive on that a bit later. IG 2000 is another very solid card, probably one of the better Underworld cards we were given in this set. Remember, you're going to be pinging things, which means things will have less health. So there's going to be situations where your opponent might have like a 2 health unit and a 1 health unit, and bam, IG comes down, pings both, kills one, then Cad Bane's ability kills the other. Sweet. Just a very good card. Really like how it synergizes with Cad Bane, giving you that extra damage. Works really well. And then Boba Fett is another new card that is also very powerful with Cad Bane. You'll see here that the Contracted Jumpmaster, Mist Hunter, and IG 2000 are all transports, which means they will all enable Boba's 2 damage ping, not his 1 damage ping. And on top of that, he is an Underworld, and just because you play him as an upgrade doesn't mean he won't trigger Cad Bane. So you can actually get a 3 damage ping for 2 cost with Boba, while also buffing your unit. Really good when you're buffing a Sentinel. You buff the Contracted Jumpmaster, all of a sudden it's a 4/7 in space with Sentinel. And then cap this all off with the fact that this is a 5/4 shielded unit, which is quite good against some decks, especially like Piet, who does not like to see chunky units on the ground. It really just needs like barrages and turbo lasers to deal with them. But none of that works when you have a shielded unit. So Boba Fett, another standout. And then all the way at the bottom here, we see Commandeer. This is another tech card specifically for Django. It has some play in other matchups, but talk about how they play like Sneak Attack, Triple Dark Raid. Sometimes they just slam these 6-cost units like Ruthless Raider and War Juggernaut. Well, Commandeer takes them, hits them back with it, puts it back in their hand. Huge tempo swing. Sometimes helps you bridge damage in the game where like they're ahead in a damage race, but all of a sudden you create a big damage swing against them. You're able to sometimes trade off units, especially against even other decks that just play multiple space units. You can like steal one, bash it into the other because it does ready it, unlike something like Change of Heart. So Commandeer, really nice. It is a trick, which is maybe something you can look at with Jabba, which we'll mention. But right now, no Jabba, but just Commandeer. And last but not least, we have the Cad Bane unit. The main finisher for this build works tremendously well, especially with Cad Bane's ping. It means he can capture even more health worth of units. Guy can eat Avengers as is if needed. Just a very useful unit to have, and he smacks for 7, right? So he can turn the corner very quickly, even if your opponent decides to rescue something. It's not that huge of a deal if they can't remove this guy. You just get in for 7, and then maybe another 7, and then the game can end. He is the true end game for this deck and works very well with the rest of the stuff going on. Sideboard we will cover a bit later. So let's talk about the 2-drops here. So the ones at the top 4 and the one on the left, bottom left, those are the 5 that are in the deck right now. Now Sidana Thano, I mentioned it early, not by name, but this is a card that can kill Lurking TIE Phantom just as is for 2 cost. Because of his flexibility, I've opted to include this, even though I don't think Lurking TIE Phantom is super prominent, because, you know, this still trades into other 3 health ground units because of Cad Bane's ping, which means the fact that it's a 2/2 is less important in the Cad Bane deck, and then the fact that it has all this upside where it can just like one-shot 3 health space units, right, with Cad Bane's ping, and then the -2/-2 is really useful. Can turn off your opponent's ability to pilot something if they're playing like a pilot leader. It's just a pretty flexible card. Crafty Smuggler is just core. I wish I could play more Crafty Smugglers, but we don't get access to Elite in Villain. But just really useful unit. Cartel Spacer, another really solid card, especially against like 4-cost leaders like Sabine, maybe even Kaz if they're trying to like pilot onto things. It's just going to help buy some time. Its stats are fine. I think overall it's just a better card than the Starhopper for a deck like this because we are not pushing that much damage early. But Starhopper is okay. We included one just to get our 2-drop count a bit higher. And Bazine, you know, nothing wrong with leading with Bazine in this deck. Of course, if you can like trigger a Tarkintown on turn 1 and then maybe brick your opponent's next turn or hit some of a ramp card that they need or their Triple Dark Raid or whatever important stuff, Bazine is really good, and just having that smuggle upside later helps a ton. It works really well with McClunky, where you can like replay her. So Bazine, I've enjoyed having access to in this deck. So a few that I'm considering right now, Cloud Rider. I think the issue with Cloud Rider right now is twofold. First of all, you don't want 1 health units sticking around too often. So if your opponent starts space and you play like a Cloud Rider and then they play like anything that pings, you're in trouble. And there's just not a lot of units right now that this kills like for value. You would want like 4 health units for Cloud Rider to like get Cad Bane's trigger and then like get a big ambush off and like you trade up in resources, but there's not a lot of that going on. As for Greedo, I really miss this guy. I think it's a little hazardous to be playing a 1 health unit like I mentioned, but Greedo probably would be the one I would opt for, especially because it turns on the turn 1 McClunky. And there are some decks like against Han, for instance, where Greedo could be very useful just having more ground 3 power units. But right now he's in the side, not even in the sideboard. He's just not in the deck, but certainly could find his way back in. And then Guavian Antagonizer would be another decent 1-drop that you may want to include. Of course, way bigger downside than Greedo in the sense of like your opponent draws a card, but also maybe more upside in that it doesn't just get like pinged to death and you're just really, really sad. All right, the leader ability. So we talk a lot about this. It comes up throughout the whole deck video, but early in the game, you're trying to trigger Tarkintown so that you can kind of take control of the board, have more units than your opponent. We know it works really well with ambush units, especially when the board is clear. Like the Forlom can kill things like Tech, DJ, Kira, Cassian, whatever it may be, Bosk as well. And we know how good it is with McClunky. So what we're trying to do here throughout the early stage of the game is just make our units trade up into theirs. And a big thing about this game in general is that most units have more health than they have power. Not all, but most, which makes his ability very useful, right? Like your 3/4 Mist Hunter can kill their 3/4 Falcon because you pinged, right? Your Mist Hunter came with an extra damage attached to it. Your 2/3 kills their 2/3. Your Crafty Smuggler kills their Crafty Smuggler because your ping broke their shield. Whatever it may be. That's kind of the goal here, is to create effective trades and bridge into the Cad Bane flip turn, where you try to take over the game with even bigger pings and then also just a giant health beater. That's kind of the goal here, and it culminates with the Cad flip turn, where there's a few things I look for on this turn. The first thing you can look for is like, I have 2 Underworld cards. You want to try to play one of them before you flip and then one after to get his extra pings. This often can be done with something like Crafty Smuggler and McClunky. You like play the Crafty Smuggler, you flip Cad Bane, you McClunky. All of a sudden you've dealt 6 damage for 3 resources spread around as needed, right? That can be very, very effective. And it leaves you with like 3 resources to do something like Relentless Pursuit, which I really like to do on the Cad Bane flip turn. Get that shield up on him, eat like a 6-drop, create a huge board swing. Another thing I look for is Hotshot Blaster, getting this on him early, hitting for 6, giving you closing speed in the game, right? Because we're not a fast deck. I talked about that earlier, but we also don't have the kind of finishers that a lot of decks do, not even the kind of finishers that a Django deck might have with like Devastator now. So even though we're definitely a slower deck and we want to be like the control into Django, we have to find a way to actually end the game. And Hotshot on Cad Bane is one of those ways, with Relentless Pursuit as well, so that he can't get exhausted. It's important, right? And Hotshot is another good card that I like to look out for here. McClunky, always look out, especially because it's so cheap, so you can pair it with things like Forlom or Bosk on his flip turn. And Cad Bane being able to do 2 damage once he's out with any Underworld card is tremendous value. That really stacks up. That's real damage, and be surprised how you can start whittling your opponent's board once he's out there if he's not interacted with. All right, so bridging. I've mentioned this a few times. What is our goal? So our goal is to get to the flip turn, try to turn the corner between our Cad Bane leader, the Cad Bane unit, and just by sheer like osmosis, where like throughout the game we were playing units that were sticking on the board while defeating our opponent's units. So you're at this like stage of the game, 7 resources, and you have 3 units out and they have 1 unit out, right? And then all of a sudden you turn really quickly and try to end the game. So we are trying to bridge early, and early, that means we use Tarkintown to bridge the first couple turns to stay ahead that way. And we use ambush units like Forlom and Bosk. We use effective trades like Misshunter killing their 4 health ship, and whatever it may be, McClunky to turn a corner in that early game so that we can bridge to this mid game where, like I said, we do hit things like Forlom Boss, but even Zuckuss, and that's when we use things like Commandeer, No Good to Me Dead, and Relentless Pursuit to maybe not get insane value, but get back tempo that we may have lost by the fact that we are playing a 6-cost deploy leader, not a 5-cost or 4-cost deploy. So we are using things that may be card negative, like No Good to Me Dead. Even Relentless Pursuit sometimes can be card negative once they free the unit. Commandeer, that's usually card negative, right? If you're not killing something because you've lost a card and theirs goes back to their hand. But that's okay because we're getting value elsewhere, and we'll make up that card advantage when Cad Bane is out, because he himself is massive card advantage. He's a very big leader, very big health pool that starts whittling down your opponent's units, and then all the way bridge all the way to the end to the Cad Bane unit that really can kind of put a hammer down against a lot of decks. Now, each deck that you deal with does usually have ways around this, right? Like if you bridge to a Cad Bane against Han, but you're like way behind on tempo on board, he's not going to be good because they'll bounce him and then they'll just be way ahead. But if you've been able to control the board and you play him and then like they bounce him, it's fine, right? Because you're already ahead and you're just going to redo it, right? Against Quinlan, their out for this guy is their Han, right? But if you're able to be ahead towards that point, they need to Han first, and you can capture the Han. Like, it becomes this chess match of like who's playing their 7-drop first. Django, for instance, they don't have very clean answers to Cad. They kind of need to go over him. You Cad, you slurp up all their units, but then they play like a triple dark raid and just try to kill you with like a Devastator, right? Cad Bane can eat these cards though. So if you're using him to react, when Devastator comes out, he can actually swallow up a Devastator. So Cad Bane, very important kind of hammer to end games, especially against the not like turbo aggro stuff. But that is kind of the concept of bridging. We're using early game Tarkintown and value trades. Mid game, we use our ambush units and our events that might be card disadvantage to help prolong to our flip turn, where we kind of try to gain back all that tempo and then get to Cad Bane unit. All right, do we pass? In a lot of cases, yes. In Cad Bane, because you are a leader that wants to go longer, in a lot of cases, you should be passing. Like against Quinlan, I'd be down to just pass, let them play first. Against like Sabine, for instance, I'd be down to pass, let them play first most of the time. Some of this will change based on the texture of your hand, but in a lot of cases. Where do we not pass? I probably wouldn't pass into Han, to be honest. We practiced multiple ways of kind of in dealing with like the Cad Bane and Han matchup. The problem with passing into Han is they will just pass back if they know what they're doing. And then you're just a turn later. And then, okay, well, do you play something? Well, maybe they'll just bounce it. And then do you play something? Maybe they'll just bounce it again, or play a Kira and block whatever card it is that can interact with their flip turn. And then bam, all of a sudden, it doesn't really matter what you're doing. You're getting DJ'd and you can't do anything about it. If you knew the Han was going to play a unit on turn 1, I would certainly pass and get that ping off. At this point, I'm going to tell you what I think you should be doing against the elite of the Hans, and that is probably not pass, because I think they will just pass back to you, and you will not win this game because you will get DJ'd. So you need to create a board presence early. We have a lot of main deck stuff like the 3 No Good to Me Deads and the Cham Syndullas to help in this matchup specifically, and even more in the sideboard, but it is not as clean as a matchup as it may seem. Like, oh, we have ambush units, we have a lot of unit board control stuff. Well, yes, but we also are very soft to DJ. We need very particular cards, and we need them to not exactly understand the full texture of the matchup, which is they actually want the board to be clear, just like you do, because the cleaner it is, the easier it is for them to create an uninterrupted Han flip turn. And they could DJ you that turn. They can even Han you if you played like a big unit, like a Zuckuss. Very difficult sometimes to maneuver that if you don't have the exact tools, like no good to me. But yeah, probably most of the time you shouldn't be passing turn 1 into Han. Just get your unit, get your Crafty Smuggler out there, maybe get your Bazine out there, maybe you can snipe something important from their hand, and just, you'll get your ping next time. Like basically from the rest of the game, you will get a ping off, because once you play a unit, they're never gonna not. Like, they have to respond to that. But yes, like I said, in a lot of other matchups, you're okay prolonging because you are a 6-cost leader. You are generally a slower deck than most of these other builds, and if they want to play a pass game with you, you should be okay in a lot of cases accepting. All right, Cham Syndulla, little breakdown here. A card that I think we are going to see a lot of in a lot of different red decks. But the place I think it shines the most is with 6-cost leaders that play red. So think Cad Bane. We're talking about Cad Bane right now. Maybe you'll think about something like the new Boba pilot who can play Cham. Anakin, for instance, can really benefit from this. But this was designed what appears like to be as an anti-resupply, super laser tech, whatever it may be, ramp card. They do that on turn 2. Turn 3, bam, you slam Cham. If you're a 5-cost leader, you can immediately deploy. If not, you're deploying the next turn. And you just created when this actually procs, it's massive, right? You created like a super laser tech on steroids when this actually works. But where it actually might even be better than that is against Han, because he's very predictable. He does the thing every game, right? On 5 resources, he's always going to do this. And then bam, you slam Cham and you flip Cad. And even if you get DJ'd, which is actually very possible, like if you're playing Cham that turn, you really don't interact with DJ, but all of a sudden you have game in a match, in a scenario you probably wouldn't have. And even better if they actually do a ramp on the 4 resource turn, if they don't know you have Cham, or if they need to get like a Cantina bouncer out because you took control of the board a little earlier, and you can Cham on that turn, then you should actually just like walk away with the game if that ends up happening. So Cham has a lot of utility into Han, has a lot of utility into green ramp decks. You know, in most other matchups, you probably aren't playing it, but it is still just like an aggressively statted ground chunky unit, 4-cost 5/4. You don't see that stat line very often. So good card. Only non-underworld card in the deck right now. That spot used to be Ruthless Raider, which is in the sideboard right now. But yeah, Cham. All right, I want to talk about the omission of Jabba the Hutt. So my issue with him right now is against Han and Jango. He's just mostly too slow. He's always been kind of too slow against Sabine. So the meta is a little hazardous for wanting to play like a value engine like Jabba. It is not terrible into some of these matchups, but now that we have like a new 4-drop like IG 2000 and also the Cham Syndulla, it is very difficult to fit this in. On top of that, I'm not really trying to play now. There are 2 of them right now. There's a lot of bounce. There's a lot of exhausting effects from Jango. I overall wasn't even loving it that much in the previous set. I thought it like did create some spike win potential for this deck where it otherwise did not have such an option. But if I'm off that and I'm putting Ruthless Raiders in the sideboard, so sneak attack now is not that great, then all of a sudden the trick package also is getting pretty light, and so together it's not really worth it. And I think if you include Jabba, you need to include more tricks, like 8 minimum, but probably a little more than that, which then takes away room for non-trick events. So think Relentless Pursuit. It's a card I couldn't really run. No Good to Me Dead. It's hard to get it all the way up to 3 times if you need all the tricks. So it kind of helps a little bit to not need to do this right now, because I am looking to play a lot of other tech cards that aren't tricks. But Commandeer being a trick is one thing that does add some value to Jabba, and I don't think it's ridiculous, and he might end up making decks at some point. All right, so let's talk about a few matchups. This once again is not going to be a full matchup breakdown. It's too early in the meta. I mean, there isn't really a meta yet. The reason I'm including these is because Django and Han, in my mind, are what most people expect to be the top two decks. And then Piet is a newcomer, so I want to give a little insight there. There's definitely others, like Quinlan is going to be a deck. Sabine will likely be a deck. There might be some other aggro decks like Kaz. But once that solidifies, get more information going. But for now, let's talk about Django, number one. So we have some tech cards here for him that we mentioned, like Commandeer, first TDR sneak turns, or whenever they just start slamming finishers. We want to get Django off the board. Ideally, when possible. It's a little difficult for this deck to deal a chunk of 7, but it is possible. Of course, Zuckuss can do it, but it's very rare where your opponent lets that line up. But another important card here will be Relentless Pursuit to kind of give you cross-arena interaction while also shielding up a unit so that you can push damage, and that's pretty important. Contracted Jumpstarter will definitely help in that early game to just kind of trade units and block damage. And you want to, a lot of the time, save them for later because there's going to be situations where you're able to start pushing damage. Maybe you got a hot shot on your CAD and you're starting to close, right? You're hitting 6, you're hitting 6. But there's always this looming threat of something like Devastator coming down. And having a backup like Contracted Jumpmaster or Postboard Electromagnetic Pulse just to like prevent all that damage, because generally they have to use all their resources to do these big plays. It's the one downside for this Django, like new Django, is that like, all right, they pay 6 for this stuff, right? They pay 8 for this stuff, and that's all they're doing. And if you have Waylay, or if you have No Good to Me Dead, if you have this Sentinel to just block some damage, EMP to just exhaust the unit, then you can keep pushing damage while not taking any, and that can really change the course of these games. You are focusing on board management. You are the control in this matchup, but you do need to find ways to actually squeeze damage through against them, because the longer it goes, they will find more reach, like Ruthless Raiders and Devastators. As for Han, so like I mentioned in the pass section, you can't really play that game with them. If they kind of identify that they can just pass back to you and start doing that, you're going to have issues with getting DJ'd. But we want to have our answer to the flip turn in the form of like No Good to Me Dead or Cham Syndulla, and we want to just bash into units as much as possible and keep the board clear as much as possible. They won't always be able to DJ you, and that's fine, especially like if we put Force Chokes in the deck. That can be a way to like have a 2-cost answer to DJ. You want to get techs off the board whenever possible. You don't really want to be in space against this deck. Most of the important stuff happens on the ground, and you need to be able to interact on the ground just to get the Han off the board, get their 5 health Kiras and techs and DJs off the board. You are the control for the most part, but if you're able to maneuver past that Han flip turn and not get DJ'd, you can start turning the corner against them. You have good ambush units, which are difficult for them sometimes to deal with, especially when the board gets condensed. Cad Bane can actually be pretty helpful against them, kind of forcing them into having to bounce it because they don't really have other clear answers for it. But Han, you can see the main deck is invested in beating Han, and the post board is going to have some help too. So it is something that I think you need to keep in mind. It's a much more difficult matchup, I think, than it might like look like on paper against a savvy Han player. And Piet, this is a very linear deck. They want to ramp and then they want to play big ships. And, you know, Cad is not a very fast deck. It's not effectively going to aggro out a Piet, but it does actually present interesting challenges for Piet in the form of like, basically we're just playing on the ground against them. So their ships don't really present like brick walls for us. You just want to like curve out on the ground. You can kill Piet usually pretty quickly because you have ambush units and the pings. If you get him off the board and you like keep them from like getting an incredibly early like Avenger or something, that can be great. We have a bounce for their units. We have commandeers for their mid-range threats like Gladiator, Star Destroyer, or other units that might be able to carry a large barrage. And that's something you should look out for, is just like keep Keep in mind that their main interaction for the ground with those big units is going to be Barrage, something like Turbo Laser Salve. In red, it might be Planetary Bombardment if they manage to play a Devastator. But in general, they're playing one of these units, and if you can like capture it, for instance, with Cad Bane, it can capture 6 drops. So like you can keep the Gladiators or the Resupply Couriers off the board. If they play a bigger unit, you might be able to, if you held onto your Tarkintown, you might be able to sequence a turn with like McClunky, or maybe a space unit to attack and then Tarkintown, and then like a ping to remove it, right? If you keep them from being able to play meaningful barrages, that can be very powerful. We have shields between Relentless Pursuit, Crafty Smuggler, and the Boba unit, the 5-cost Boba unit, which is very powerful against them as well. And you're just going to try to push damage on the ground. You'll remove Piet as needed, and then just try to keep space as clear as possible. If you can get to Cad Bane, he will slurp up basically any ship in their deck outside of just the like 10 health Devastator. But even if that one could potentially get slurped if you get a double ping with Cad Bane when he's out. So if he's like shielded and they can't kill him with Devastator, and then you play Cad, deal 2, eat Devastator. There are ways to maneuver around that. You have Bazine to try to target ramp early. You have Hotshot Blasters to help close. So it's not like always super easy, but there are more tools for this Cad Bane deck than it might look like initially, just because of how ground focused it is and how it does have cross arena interaction. All right, let's talk about the sideboard real quick. EMP is mostly here to help even further with the Django matchup. You might bring it in against some other space decks or vehicle decks, but that's where it really shines, especially to just like block a TDR turn or a sneak attack turn. The Force Chokes, they're for the Han deck to be able to kill all their 5 health units, but it's also useful against Sabine or any other ground aggro deck. Waylay, we want that against Piet primarily. So like pre-board against Piet, we might have a little issue, but like I said, it'll definitely help post-board to get Waylay in. They just like playing one chunky unit a turn. So play 3 cost, bounce it, deploy further. Then they have to like spend another turn replaying it, and then bam, like you just delay, right, and push damage as you delay. We got the third Commandeer here. Django is still like target number 1, or Django and Han are still targets 1A and 1B. So we're going to play the third Commandeer. It's good there. You might find some room to include it in some other matchups. And Ruthless Raider for basically anything control related. It's actually a pretty good card into Quinlan as well. Those games tend to actually drag out a little bit, and Quinlan doesn't have clean answers for Ruthless Raider in the deck for the most part. So it is a card that can help with like the reach and the closing speed for Cad against Quinlan. But yeah, you'll play it against like any blue villain deck. You'll probably bring it in against Piet too, just because it gives you some added reach. But it's not like actually incredible there, because most of the time we actually would prefer not playing into space against them. But it can work out. So that's kind of the current sideboard. But again, this was a work in progress, and I will be updating this deck as I test with it, and all those updates will be live on my Patreon. And last but not least, a few other considerations that I want to talk about. So Daring Raid, used to play it more. It's going to be tough to include this right now, especially with like Electromagnetic Pulse existing and being like a much more effective card against like the top meta or expected top meta deck in Django. But Daring Raid will always lurk as an option. Shoot Down is another decent card. If we see more like heroic aggro decks in particular that are just trying to play things like A-Wings and stuff, and you have like a clean answer to that, that's pretty nice. Surprise Strike could help potentially in closing speed for this deck. It's just tough to fit. I mentioned it DJ before, but there's like DJ, Houndstooth, Punishing One. These are all just other options for Underworld 3 drops. DJ is nice because it's a 5 health unit, just like Boba Fett is. Houndstooth, I prefer the 3/4s to the 4/3, although it does just punch really hard, so it's an option. And Punishing One as well, I mentioned. I think Mist Hunter has a higher floor and probably a higher ceiling, but there is some room for Punishing One, especially if pilots become more popular. Gamorrean Guards can be a really good anti-aggro card, especially against like something like Sabine. It is also an Underworld, and our deck is almost entirely yellow, so works well there. IG-88, the pilot, it can give a lot of stats, more than most, and there's almost always going to be something wounded because we are pinging and IG pings. So the +3/+3, not too difficult to actually trigger. As a 5-cost unit, he can actually be a 7/5, which is pretty enormous. Talk about closing speed. Syndicate Lackeys, the one benefit this has, well, the main benefit this has over the 4-power ambushers is that it can kill Han, the leader, if Han is the only unit in play. It, of course, can also kill all those 5-health units if there's more than one unit in play. So there's certainly some upside to Syndicate Lackeys. I'm not ruling it out as a replacement for Bosk, to be honest. It's just Bosk does definitely have like game-breaking upside sometimes. And Fennec Shand is also an interesting one. If we're looking for like more top end, this can kind of do like a Han Solo impression in this deck. You do play a lot of different costs up and down the curve, and then with Cad Bane's ability, getting that extra ping before she actually needs to attack, she can often finish like 4, 5, even 6 health units before taking any damage back, and that can be pretty useful. And she could actually like pretty easily one-shot things like Jango and Quinlan. So I think Fennec is an interesting card to look at. All right, that's what I got for you. Let me know what you think of Cad Bane. Let me know what you think of the guide. If you're looking for updates to this Cad Bane deck, as well as any other decks that I might feature, they'll all be up on Patreon with live updates, and I got a lot more going on there as well. But yeah, leave a comment. Let me know what you think, and until next time, take care.